So in the previous video, we talked about the 3 pillars of worship piano and keys, and today we're going to dive more in depth onto one of those pillars being chord structure. And we're going to be focusing on the basics being suspensions, inversions, and sevenths. Now, as a preface, I am not a music theory teacher, so my terminology and the words I say are not going to be exactly what you'd see in a music theory book, so just keep that in mind as we go along, and we should be just fine. All right, so to start, let's talk about what suspensions, inversions, and sevenths are. So a suspension in like easy terms is when you take the third of a chord. So let's say take the C chord. The third is that E. So suspension would be if you take that E and you shift it to the F, the fourth. Or if you shifted it to the second, the D. So it's important to know why we do this though, because sure you might know what a suspension is, but you got to understand the context of it. So a suspension basically accomplishes a build in tension. It sounds wrong. It sounds weird. It sounds like it needs to get resolved. You're suspending a note where it's not supposed to be. This is home. This wants to go home. So that whole building in tension relates to storytelling as a whole. In every great story, there's a build intention and a release intention. So a quick suspension to resolution is really gratifying to people who are participating in music because it's ingrained in us to feel that release. So it's this to this, and boom, you're at home. So you compare a suspension with a chord change or just returning to the actual chord, and that's a really powerful tool that we use in worship piano and keys because it's super cathartic for the audience or the congregation. It's just this deep emotional feeling of like, okay, we were at unrest and now we're at rest. So an example of this could be at the end of 10,000 Reasons, like at the end of a phrase in 10,000 Reasons, there's this line that goes, so that is a sort of suspension where you take the G chord and you keep the bass of it, that G, but you move the third to the fourth and you bring it back to the third. Another example could be in Great Are You, Lord, in the bridge, the all the earth will shout your praise. That starts on a G, so it goes. Then it goes up to the suspension with the fourth. And then what you saw right there was we went from the fourth suspension to the 4 chord. So that was a suspension in a chord change, and the 10,000 Reasons one was a suspension back to the actual chord. So those are both super cool tools. We'll use them a lot in worship. You should definitely start to pay attention for where those are in the songs that you're learning and just how you can fit those into your moments of reflection. All right, so the next part we're going to talk about is inversions. Inversions you've probably learned about if you've played piano for more than 3 years. An inversion is when you take the notes of a chord, say, go back to that C chord again, and you just rearrange them. So in a block chord, typically you'll see the root note on the bottom. So a first inversion is just when you take that root note and you bring it to the top. So block chord C, first inversion C, then you can bring the E up, and that becomes the second inversion C. So again, block chord C, first inversion C, second inversion C. And they just basically help to expand the sound of what a chord can be and just make it sound prettier. And what you'll learn over time as you play is certain rearrangements or inversions of chords will sound better for certain moments of the song. Like I always like to end songs on on a second inversion, just because I like hearing the third as the leading tone. So, like say I did like a 4, 3, 2, 1 walk down, and I drop it down to a C second inversion to make it sound nice at the end. And then, you know, obviously the important part to think about is what you're gonna hear most is the highest note in your chord. So you typically hear that. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about like what harmonies you're trying to create or what you want the audience to hear as you're shaping melodies. All right, so the last sub point is sevenths. All right, this could get tricky. So in a traditional chord, you have your first, your third, and your fifth. So those are 3 notes separated by 2 notes in their respective key. So think of your C chord and the key of C. It's all white keys. You start with C, the third is just up 2 notes, the fifth is up 2 notes. Now your seventh is just, again, up 2 notes in the key. So that adds a ton of color. All right, and there are also 3 different kinds of seventh chords. There's the major, the minor, and the dominant. So minor sevenths are added to minor chords, major sevenths are added to most major chords, and dominant sevenths are only added to the 5th chord of a key. That's why I say major sevenths go to most of the major chords. So if we walk that up in the key of C, you have C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G dominant 7, A minor 7. This one's really weird. You got your B diminished 7th. You don't really have to worry about that one. You're never gonna see that in worship music. People like pretty chords in worship music. A diminished is a horrible chord in worship music. So the way you want to think about a 7th chord is it just adds a lot of color to the key or to the chord, and it's like an exclamation point. Everything that a C chord is becomes that much more when you add the 7th to it. So like your C, add that 7, it's just full of flavor. And again, you can just use those with inversion like I did right here. This was a second inversion, you just add the 7th. You can add it below your root note. And then on that exclamation point road trip, major and minor 7ths can sound very sweet, and a dominant 7th is sour. It's supposed to be very tense because it emphasizes that desire for the 5th chord to go back to your root or the 1 chord. So think about how most chord progressions, the 5 wants to go to the 1 anyway. So like you take your 6, 2, 5, 1. It's a classic chord progression. So in the key of C, that's A minor, D minor, G, and that really wants to go back to your C. Now if you turn that 5 chord, that G, into a 7th, it just it wants to go back home that much more. All right, so just to recap, suspensions build tension and release tension. Inversions change the color or like the way that the chord sounds, and you want to focus on the highest note. And 7ths are like an exclamation point. They make everything about that chord more. Also, a quick thing to add to the suspensions, sometimes the suspense isn't meant to be resolved right immediately. So a lot of worship songs like to take your 1 and your 5. So like your 1 is your C in the key of C, and your 5 is your G. A lot of worship songs like to focus on making sure that those are played at all times. The problem is the 5 isn't found in the 4 chord, so like your F chord. But a lot of worship songs, they just play your F chord without the A and replace it with the G because they want to keep that home base of the 1 and the 5. So they play like this without ever going back to the, just because for consistent sound. So we'll talk about that in why we do what we do. So now that we know what suspensions, inversions, and sevenths are, we can dive a little bit more into the why we do what we do, or the theory behind like the choices you make. So again, the important thing to keep in mind is that as musicians, you're always telling a story. Music is just another form of story. And suspensions, inversions, and sevenths are just tools that you get to use as a storyteller to drive the story across to the audience or the listener. And again, those tools can be used to, heighten the emotion that you're feeling or to make it more subtle. So, for instance, more subtle moments of songs, what you can do is you can just keep the chords as close to each other as possible and play as little notes as you can. Like try to find the chords, find the notes you can play for every chord in your chord progression and just stick to those instead of moving around like a bunch. So the example I wrote up was Christ Be Magnified, the first verse. The piano player just sits on the 1 and the 5, G and D, and then the bass goes. But an example that I like better is the first verse of King of My Heart. So a lot of people, when they play the first verse of King of My Heart, they'll do in the key of A. So that's A, D, A, F sharp minor, E, D, back to the A. That's way too much for the first verse. The first verse is a subtle and sweet part of the song. The focus is not on the piano, the focus is on the singer. So what you can do is use that suspensions that we talked about earlier and get yourself out of the way. Only play the 1, the A, and the 5, the E. And those are your only 2 notes for that entire first verse. You'll build as the song builds, but for the first verse, stay out the way. The singer's voice, the words are the focus for what everybody should be centering themselves on as we head into that moment of worship. And so you can move the bass notes around, but you'll be creating suspensions and sevenths and inversions simply by just playing these 2 notes. That's all you have to do. So think about like, let the King of my heart. And so to think about like, okay, what that looks like. This is just an A inverted. And for, inversions, let's just think about the right hand. This isn't an A inverted because of the root notes of the bass notes, but just focus on the right hand. A inverted, D suspended. So it's an F sharp minor 7th, That's an E suspended, D suspended, back to that A inverted. And all you had to do was just play 2 notes. And so that's like just, one example of how all of those different tools might seem like a bunch and you need to do all of this and that. It really looks that simple sometimes. To wrap it all up, if you focus too much on playing the chords the way they're written, you'll lose out on the consistency of sound that you can build and the storytelling that you can offer to the song. By using the tools that we talked about, like suspensions, inversions, and sevenths, and hopefully you understood what those were based on the way I think about them, you can, create a better sound for the moment of the song that you're playing. And it doesn't have to look like huge, gigantic chords all the time. For the subtle moments, you can just play the 1 and the 5 and get away with anything. Those will work for every chord, basically. So as you go and listen to the boosts, and you start to focus on like, why did the piano player play this when the chord chart says something different? Hopefully you can get the gears turning, listen to it a little bit more, and figure out what were they using there. What were they using? Suspensions? Were they using inversions, sevenths? Like what's different about the way that was written? And then you can grow in your theory about how should I shape chords in my moments of prayer or reflection. So hopefully you can use these tools. If you have any questions, again, reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you work through it. But yeah, that's chord structure, the basics of chord structure. All right.